The Economist. Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Jason Palmer.
And I'm Rosie Blore. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
If you wish to continue listening to this podcast, please press 1. Otherwise, please hold. The automation of customer service has left much to be desired, but AI could really change the stakes. We ask how things might become a little less annoying.
And the LIV Tour upended the world of golf, a fierce independent competitor to the storied PGA. Now, talk has turned to merging the two. But first, after decades of shadow war between the Jewish state and the Islamic Republic, in the early hours of Saturday, Israel carried out its first officially acknowledged attack on Iran. Dozens of Israeli warplanes launched missiles against air defense facilities and weapons factories. That came nearly 4 weeks after Iran bombarded Israel with 181 ballistic missiles.
בשעות הבוקר המוקדמות של יום שבת קיימנו את הבטחתנו.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the attack had fulfilled Israel's promise to land a strategic blow on Iran.
יכולתה לייצר טילים שמכוונים כלפינו, שאין כדוגמתה.
But despite the rhetoric, this was not the all-out assault that some had expected.
These Israeli attacks on Iran were on the more limited end of what Israel had considered. It avoided strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities or important economic facilities like oil terminals.
Greg Karlstrom is our Middle East correspondent.
It was focused strictly on military installations, so not the dramatic blow that some people feared that it would be, but still, I think, a meaningful strike on Iran's interests.
We've been expecting an attack on Iran from Israel for weeks. Why did they choose, as you say, a more limited option?
I think a lot of that has to do with the political calendar in the United States. If you talk to the Americans, they will take credit for Israel's restraint. They will say that it was pressure from the Biden administration, which told Israel both in public and in private that it did not want to see attacks on nuclear facilities or oil facilities or other economically significant targets. I think for Prime Minister Netanyahu, it was just a rational calculation. If he 10 days before the American election, struck at Iran's oil facilities, for example, did something that would have sent oil prices spiking, would have sent gas prices in America spiking. That would have been perceived by Democrats as trying to harm Kamala Harris's chances of winning the election and trying to help Donald Trump. And so I think Netanyahu understood that it was probably best politically to go with a more limited strike right now and leave the door open to perhaps a more significant one a bit further down the road.
So what would you say then that the goal of these limited attacks was, and how effective was that?
Well, the goal seems to have been twofold. First, Israeli jets struck at Iran's air defenses, particularly its S-300s, which are Russian-made air defense batteries. And then the second target seems to have been facilities linked to Iran's ballistic missile program. For example, Israel is said to have targeted what are called planetary mixers, which are very complicated devices that are used to create solid fuel for fueling ballistic missiles. They also seem to have struck at a factory that produces the motors for those missiles. And so there are certain points in the supply chain, the manufacturing supply chain for these weapons, where they're quite vulnerable and it's quite difficult if these sorts of things are damaged and time-consuming to replace them. And so that seems to have been what Israel was trying to destroy here. How successful it was, I think it's a bit too early to say. I think we have to wait for satellite imagery to come out, commercial satellite imagery that analysts can assess and tell us how successful these attacks were. The Iranians have downplayed them altogether. They've tried to say that their air defenses intercepted most of these missiles and no damage was done. They seem to be lying. The preliminary assessments that we've seen so far suggest that there was some real damage here, but exactly what was damaged, again, I think we have to wait and see.
And what is Iran's response actually likely to be?
We heard from the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, on Sunday, who basically handed that over to his subordinates. He said, whatever they want the response to be, whatever the appropriate officials decide the response should be, that should be the response. And so that was interpreted by many observers as being Khamenei not in a rush to retaliate for this. He didn't speak of a need to retaliate that would create pressure within the Iranian system on other officials to go ahead with a response. And so I think for the moment, there's going to be a debate about this inside of Iran, and they might bide their time. I think they have a capability to respond. Israel struck at the supply chain for ballistic missiles, but not those missiles themselves. It doesn't seem to have targeted missile depots where these missiles were stockpiled. So Iran would be able to retaliate again the way it did on October 1st with that barrage of 181 ballistic missiles. But if it does that, it may not be able to replenish the missiles it uses. And so I think that will be part of the calculation for Iran. And I think they also need to assess the damage to their air defenses, because if Israel was indeed successful in destroying Iran's S-300 batteries, that will leave them very, very vulnerable to another Israeli attack if they choose to retaliate now.
And we've talked about the pressure on Netanyahu from the US, but what about the political pressures at home? How have Saturday's attacks gone down within Israel?
There's been a lot of criticism from his rivals within Israel. That we had several weeks before this where Netanyahu himself, Yoav Gallant, his defense minister, other Israeli officials really raised expectations for this attack. And there have been some Israeli politicians over the past 2 days who have argued that Israel underdelivered. Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, Naftali Bennett, a former prime minister, people like that, arguing that Israel should have gone further and struck at either economic or nuclear sites, which of course is an easy argument for them to make because they're not in power and they wouldn't have to deal with the fallout with the Biden administration if they did that. So there's criticism around the strike itself. And then, of course, there's ongoing criticism of the way Israel is conducting its other wars in Gaza and in Lebanon. Yesterday was a memorial service for the October 7th attacks. It was the first anniversary of those attacks on the Hebrew calendar. Netanyahu spoke and he was heckled by relatives of victims, by people whose loved ones were taken hostage, are still being held in Gaza a year later. So there remains a great deal of public criticism around the conduct, particularly of the war in Gaza.
And you said that the limited nature and timing of these attacks was partly about, or mainly about, the US election. What might we expect after the US election, which of course is only just over a week away now?
I think that may depend on the outcome of the US election. If it's a Trump victory, he is on the record as supporting Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And I think Netanyahu will take that as an encouragement. Now, Israel might not decide to strike at those facilities unilaterally. If Trump wins, Netanyahu might decide to wait until Trump takes office in January and then try to coordinate a joint Israeli-American strike, which would be able to do significantly more damage than Israel could do alone. But either way, I think Netanyahu will take that as sort of an open door to carry out further attacks. If Harris wins, I think it's a bit more complicated, but I think regardless of who wins, we're also getting into this period where Joe Biden will be a lame duck, where Netanyahu has spent the better part of a year now ignoring the president's wishes around Gaza, around Lebanon. He does seem to have listened in this one particular instance around Iran, but I think we'll have 2 months where Netanyahu might feel more emboldened than ever as we're in the waning days of the Biden administration.
Greg, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.
All operators are busy at this time. Please hold.
This is as close in this fragmented world that we get to a human universal. We've almost all of us had to do this, waiting for customer service, the hold music, the seeming contradiction in the suggestion that
your call is very important to us. Please hold.
And the menus. When I hear the option that I think is mine, I honestly hold up that number of fingers to remember it while I listen to the rest of the list.
Please press 9.
Maybe you'd already sent an email. Maybe you had an uncanny valley chat with a bot. Maybe this little task is gonna drive you over the edge. And maybe one believable promise of artificial intelligence is that it can pull you back.
Technology in call centres and in customer service has always tended to drive people mad.
Henry Tricks is our US technology editor.
Entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are addressing this. They're betting that generative AI can make it all a lot less awful. AI assistants have learned to talk and listen to you, and they're already taking root in customer service. The question is, will they convince customers? And if they do, what happens to all the human customer service employees?
Now, when you say that AI is already kind of taking root in this application, what do you mean? What's out there?
Some of the examples so far are actually quite positive. In May, for example, Sonos, which makes those home audio systems, they used a generative AI-powered customer service bot. And it was really a trial by fire because it was introduced very shortly before there was a huge volume of complaints against Sonos for an app update that was full of glitches. And this could have been a disaster, but actually the AI assistant that Sonos had adopted was able to digest Sonos's training materials and come up with its own workaround for the glitch. If you look broadly, surveys suggest that half of customer service executives think that AI chatbots will have a significant impact on their organization in the next 12 to 18 months. And there are lots of new products being launched. For example, Sierra, the company that made that Sonos voice assistant, is raising money at a $4 billion valuation at the moment, and funding for startups that are developing AI customer service tools reached $170 million globally in the third quarter, which is about 3 times as much, or more than 3 times as much than the year before. And it's not just startups. All of the tech giants like Alphabet, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, they're introducing customer service AIs, and plenty of other software companies are too.
And I guess the point here is that this isn't the old style, just an automated voice going through a lookup table and giving you a sort of pat response to direct questions. This is something that is actually kind of crunching through, even coming up with its own answers.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it thinks quite laterally. So, for example, I spoke to an AI assistant that had been created by Crescendo, another startup, that was giving information about a balloon festival in the southwest of the United States. I could ask it where to park. I asked it what the weather was like, and it told me how I should dress. So you do get the sense that you are talking to a thinking assistant, even though it's not thinking in the real sense of the word. It's also interesting in the way that artificial intelligence is changing the business model of customer service. So it used to be that you were charged per minute, which was one of the reasons why you get kept on calls for such a long period of time. Now, the new technology is enabling companies to charge per outcome. In other words, by resolving your problem. And that's beneficial for the customer, and it's also beneficial for the company that wants to improve their customer experience.
But as you say, customers might have some doubts about this, and certainly call center workers might have some doubts about all this.
Yeah, it's early days. The experience can be good, but in general, customers are not yet convinced. So 64% of those surveyed fairly recently said that they'd prefer companies not to use AI agents, mostly because they worry that it will be even more difficult to reach a human. But also there's the question of what this means for human workers. And I spoke to Rob Guller, who is the co-founder of a call center company based in Utah that's called ClearSource. And he, for example, has not introduced a voice-to-voice customer service agent yet, because he thinks that people still value that human-to-human contact. Also, generative AI bots are prone to give the wrong answers and be extremely confident about it. Air Canada was forced to compensate a passenger this year who was falsely promised by an Air Canada chatbot a discount on a ticket.
But the direction of travel here is clear. So those call center workers who think that AI might be coming for their jobs have reason to be nervous.
Yes, they do have reason to be nervous. It was predicted last year that generative AI would reduce those kind of call center jobs by 20 to 30%. And you can already see that some of these chatbots sound fairly convincing. That said, talk to any call center executive and they dismiss the risks of rampant job losses. They say the industry has traditionally been fearing job losses from new technology, whether that's from email, from those kind of voice menus, and it didn't happen. And they think that with fewer people answering calls, or at least answering the most basic calls, that will free up those call center workers to do more useful things, like using feedback to improve the products. The only drawback there is that the AI chatbots are also going to get better and better. So they may be able to do those higher value tasks too.
Henry, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Jason, great talking to you.
Very much worth waiting on hold for.
Better talking to you than to a bot.
Subscribing to Economist Podcast Plus helps make our journalism possible. Thank you. Search Economist Podcast Plus for a free trial.
Three years ago, the golf world was utterly shaken up by the arrival of Live Golf.
Mike Jakeman writes about sport and finance for The Economist.
A new tour designed to rival the established US PGA Tour, financed at tremendous expense by Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. Now, pulling sports people out of their comfort zone and into an entirely new competition is risky. They might not want to come. However, Saudi realised they would definitely come if they were attracted by some huge pay packets. We're talking 8 or 9 figures just to sign up to play on this tour. And they succeeded.
Teaming up golf's most sensational players.
Yeah, BK. Attaboy, Brooksy.
To see who will win. Live Golf. Get into a new dimension.
The PGA had the carpet ripped out from underneath them and immediately suspended many of the players that moved across to this new tour. That then set off a legal battle between Liv and the PGA that lasted until 2023, when they announced, again shocking the world, they were going to join up together. But since then, nothing. In the background, golf has continued with these two tours. Arguably, the players have been the big winners and the big losers have been golf fans.
Now, at the time it came together, the purpose was ostensibly for Saudi Arabia to economically diversify, get away from oil. A lot of people suggested instead it was part of a grand sports washing effort to polish its reputation. How was this received when, as you said, it kind of came out of the blue?
For the PGA Tour, this was a terrible day. If I can offer a different sporting analogy, this is as if a different country had set up parallel Grand Slams in tennis in Australia, France, the UK and the US, and managed to lure half of the top 128 men's players in the world onto this different tour, so that the competitions that were left were just decimated. The PGA obviously had to react quite quickly. There were the bans that I mentioned, and then they also sought to try and raise their own prize pots as a kind of defensive measure to try and keep the stars that they had managed to retain. There were a couple of high-profile holdouts. Tiger Woods, we know, was offered an extraordinary amount of money, far in excess of what Jon Rahm got, which was about $300 million, to move. And the other notable holdout was Rory McIlroy.
I still hate LIV. I hate LIV. I hope it goes away.
He won a lot of admirers for that, I think. Although, obviously, as time has gone on and the idea is that LIV and the PGA Tour might be brought back together again, his outspokenness then sort of creates a bit of a problem in terms of how to create a unified, happy family again.
But let's look at how the sport itself has gone in the meantime. How has the LIV Tour been?
The biggest effect really has been to make a group of already very wealthy sportsmen even richer. The 50-odd golfers that played the LIV season that's just concluded this year shared in excess of £300 million in prize money. One of the things that LIV has done to try and differentiate itself is to group these golfers into teams that we're supposed to care a lot about.
Why should I support your team?
Why support the high flyers?
Don't forget the Fireballs. They're the most passionate, best-looking guys in the league.
With the range goes, there's more than one way to look good.
One word, Ironheads.
I think that's two words.
We're the Crushers, and we're called that for a reason.
I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's been chosen by overexcited marketing folk on a sugar rush. It's not convincing the golf supporters. And this is the problem with LIV, is that although they've tried to innovate and tried to play fewer holes and generally kind of make it a bit sort of younger and fresher and more broadcast friendly, nobody cares. Nobody's watching this. It happened. Some people won. They made lots of money. But it doesn't have any wider cultural resonance.
And as you say, now that there's a push for these two tours to essentially merge, that's not going to be pretty.
It's quite an ask to say to Rory McIlroy, you've stayed loyal, turned down $300 million to join LIV, and your mates have gone. A year later, they've come back that much richer, and you're just supposed to play alongside them and forget the whole thing ever happened. LIV has got some genuine stars that the PGA Tour would welcome back. But there's also a lot of filler in there, a lot of guys who are past their best who may not even want to come back to the PGA Tour, but they need to work out some sort of integration plan.
So given all of those teething problems that a joined-up tour would entail, do you think it can happen? Can golf get back to what the fans might have wanted all along?
Yes, I think it probably can, but it's going to be tricky. And the biggest reason for that is actually the interest of the US government. There's a deep irony here in that when the two tours started to sue each other, LIV argued that the PGA Tour constituted a monopoly and they were denying golfers the chance to have choice as to where they practice their services. If they came together and decided there was just going to be one competition, the DOJ may well look at that as a similar monopoly. So what we might end up with is LIV as a sort of second-tier tour to exist purely so that the two organisations can claim that there is an alternative for golfers to play. I think a merger is now in everybody's interests, but it's the fans that really need this. They want to see their sport played at the highest possible level that it can be, and that involves bringing the world's best players back together.
Mike, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Intelligence. Do let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcasts@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.